English teachers and professors of Reddit, what non-plagiarized paper was the worst paper you ever graded? Not English, but history. We'd just spent 2 weeks on World War II and the kids were supposed to write a summary essay on the major events. This kid genuinely believed that World War II lasted 2 days, the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, and the next day America nuked Tokyo. I'm an English teacher, but this was when I was a TAFE or a Latin American Studies class. The final project was to be a research project about any Central American, South American or Caribbean country of the students' choosing. The topic was open, just had to be about something in one of those countries. One student turns in her first draft. The whole thing is about the country of Madagascar. When we told her it didn't fit the requirements of the assignment, she accused us of being too scared of the part where she discusses graveyards in Madagascar. Spooky. Not English but science. Year 8, so ages 12-13. Fairly simple general science end of term test. The kid had clearly decided to heed the advice to attempt all questions as we didn't use negative marking. So for every answer he didn't know he just wrote tubes. The best thing was that this included a question near the end of the paper that asked for a description of how blood was pumped around the body. I gave him half a mark. Well, maybe he vaguely remembered someone mentioning tubes and figured it must be relevant to at least one of the questions. My parents graded GCSE papers every summer. One year my mum got an English essay exam on which the kid had written, "I don't understand the question, so I'm going to write you a poem," followed by said poem and an elaborate drawing of a tropical island. He got a D. I teach chemistry, not English, but they write one big paper as a write-up after a long lab. Anyway, I had this one student, let's call him Joe, who was a pain in my butt, constantly late, disrespectful to his classmates and me, often just ditched, so he was way behind. Anytime I'd call on him during class his answer would be hydrogen. We could be talking about molecular structure. I'd call on Joe to tell me how a transition metal like iron was structurally different from a halogen, and still that's what he'd shout. Fast forward to the end of the year and the long lab write-up. All the kids, including Joe, have done the lab. I give rubrics, clear guidelines on what I expect them to discuss, and a deadline. A deadline comes and they're all submitted through Google Classroom. I start reading. I'd made it through about 10 of them, and they're okay. The kids gave it a decent shot. Then I get to Joe's essay. He literally typed the sentence, "The answer is always hydrogen," hundreds of times, enough to reach the page length requirement, and he'd done it with the correct headers for each section. 2. I was impressed with the amount of effort that had been put into screwing his grade away. This, truly, is my time. I was a teacher in a high school. I taught some lower achieving kids in an English class. They were around 14-16 years old. One kid, Paul, was particularly bad, not through a lack of intelligence, but effort. Paul is also a native English speaker. This is important to remember. Paul did not submit his persuasive essay when it was due, and continued to fail to submit it for another month and a half. I kept reminding him, phoning home, emailing other staff, etc. Paul, who was the only pupil who did not submit his essay, believed I was picking on him and singling him out. Finally, in what I can only imagine in a fit of sudden inspiration linked to this belief, I received the following unceremoniously submitted 400-word masterpiece. Is teacher bias? Perhap. Yes, perhap. It was also all typed in a funky, bold, jagged font. Here is a brief summary extract. Is teacher bias? Perhap. In my experience, teacher is very biased towards me for no reason. It went on about what he understood to be the faults in the teaching profession for most of it. However, another particular highlight was where he stated teachers can be racist, as reports have found. He proceeded to never reference this or go into detail about racism reports ever again. Paul was also white, just putting that out there. I still freaking have that essay. Obligatory. I am not a professor, but I once was in an English class with several papers that had to be peer reviewed. One of my classmates wrote a 15-page paper that was, for the most part, barely comprehensible. But the real kicker was that she directly quoted Santa Claus 2 in a final paper for a college-level senior capstone. A real person quoted the 2002 Tim Allen Christmas comedy, Santa Claus 2. We also had to discuss each other papers in class afterward. Awkward. Geography teacher here. I teach 18-year-olds. I had assigned a scientific paper of about 5 pages long. Topic was chosen from among the chapter on space. Had a student write it on the subject of the moon. Went off on the good start. Different theories of how the moon came into existence. Then suddenly she switched into astrology. It was so smooth I didn't notice until a full paragraph in. I had to explain her why she failed. Not a professor, but one of my classmates once wrote and presented on this wacky jumble of conspiracy theories about the Illuminati. The paper was bad but the presentation was awkward as frick. He was doing numerology on the chalkboard to demonstrate that the Pope was actually the Antichrist and that George Bush was one of his minions. It would have been funny, but I'm pretty sure he was schizophrenic. Everyone just got really quiet, including the professor. We had a kid like this in GR 10 Canadian history. Went into a rant about how Chrétien was an anarchist and planned to undermine American democracy by not sending Canadian troops to Iraq. He stole my topic, to which was Chrétiens and the Iraq War. There was a girl who wrote about how the English language was only partially accessible to women. Not like that men had dominated the English language in terms of publishing or less censorship, but as in there are words and phrases that are 100% incomprehensible to women because of genetic differences between men and women. I was a creative writing English major and for the most part we had to peer review our classmates' work. We had to provide positive criticisms. Early on, it became apparent that people were majoring in creative writing because it was an easy A. I remember critiquing some papers and the only positive thing that I could come up with was "I like your punctuation." That made my teacher laugh out loud in class. These quotation marks, how beautiful, yet simplistic. They speak of your past, your future, how you live your life. Your entire being clearly went into these exceptional quotation marks. I had a student in freshman comp who in her final research report based off of the novel Frankenstein used the thesis, "Genital manipulation of human beings in laboratories is wrong because God says so." No, that's not a typo. Genital manipulation, and apparently she had used find and replace, because that was the way it was through the whole 8-page paper. She clearly meant genetic manipulation. But every single instance of the phrase genetic manipulation had been replaced with genital manipulation. After I hauled myself out from under the desk in my office, where I had slid because I was crying with laughter, did I really read the paper? Apart from the crappy thesis, the paper had not a single decent source, no real argument, and the organization was chaotic at best. Worst part, I had had multiple individual conferences throughout the semester with the students to work on thesis statement and developing arguments. She never bothered to come to a single one, and was P when I failed her. I'm not a professor, but I was in a master's program for the last 2 years, and I had to peer review a classmate's paper. Holy crap, we were supposed to write a persuasive research essay on an effective way to make college more affordable. I was lucky enough to peer review a classmate and co-worker who already possessed not 1, but 2 master's degrees, and he was somehow on his way to a doctorate. I'm honestly still perplexed trying to figure out how he got those other 2 degrees. Anyways, the paper was littered with grammatical errors. My favorite of those was when he started making up words and talked about the problem of student indebtedness. He probably meant indebtedness, but he used it incorrectly multiple times, so make what you will of that. He also referred to the student debt problem as an extra layer on students' frustration cake. Yum. This person was a veteran, and at one point in the paper, he talks about the terrorist attacks of 9/11/11. I understand that that's a single number typo, but also, if you're going to state that as your reason for joining the military, at least proofread it like you care about what happened that day. The good part, however, was his actual argument. For some reason he was arguing that college should be more affordable, but only for veterans. You mean the GI Bill? He said that we could make this happen by simply cutting the salaries of professors and giving that money back to the students. We're going to save colleges and universities in America by failing to pay our professors, everyone. Not a teacher, but a math teacher in our school graded an IBSL math examination, and out of 90 marks on the test, she was able to award 1 mark. It wasn't for lack of trying either. Whoever wrote the exam tried a solid amount of the exam. except they literally didn't get anything but one question right. Actually a former English teacher, current English professor, I can't think of a single worst, but here are some crazy ones in my Hall of Fame. 1. When I taught 8th grade, I had to insist that a photo of a koala bear off Google Images would not serve as a proper paper title. 2. Just a sad one. One student half-assayed a paper with a fully MLA formatted first page, 2 sentences, and an "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lancer Landshark." 3. The paper wasn't bad, but despite going over APA title pages at length in class, I had a student who turned in their APA paper with a teal and turquoise book-like Ms. Word cover template that was gaudy and had very little of the required info. 4. I can think of many where the writing was just poor or didn't have proper grammar, but one goof from a recent semester sticks out in terms of errors in writing. The student did a good poetic analysis of the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death, cited it correctly as by Emily Dickinson, yet all throughout the paper referred to the poet as Elizabeth Dickerson. Also, in one that doesn't at all count amongst my worst but maybe one of my most memorable, I assigned a paper with the goal of arguing successfully for both sides, then mediating it as an advancement of lessons in argumentation. Most students chose from a list of very serious and difficult to solve problems, but one student requested to do a paper on the hot dogs sandwiches debate. It was an impeccable paper that did reach a nice mediation, but it was also incredibly memorable among papers on drug epidemics and immigration questions. Hot dog kid is going places. I was a chemistry TA, and a lot of students would include silly details like how much they liked their lab partner in their first report of the year. One student took this to the next level by writing out a log of his whole day before doing the experiment, what he had for breakfast, the bus he took to class, how he was 3 minutes early, everything. This was at the university level. Can't say he wasn't thorough. I teach a different subject, but a student turned in a paper that was a little shy of the length requirement at first glance. Then I started reading it. It was the same several paragraph, original, passage repeated over and over, sometimes with slight variations, for the whole length. I'm studying to be an English teacher, and had to do group peer reviews with classmates. One girl didn't have a thesis, didn't have any clear arguments, and had a 3-page paper that was 2 paragraphs long. The paper was supposed to be a proposal on how to fix an issue in higher education, and I couldn't even figure out what her problem was, and she had no proposal. The best part? After her and her friend went for the peer review, they left, leaving me and another girl to finish alone. When we got to the part to list feedback from our group, we both left clear comments about how our group left us. Studying to be an English teacher, her and her friend went. Cough. Not a teacher, but I peer reviewed the essay short story of a classmate of mine in my junior year of high school. We were supposed to write about a historical event from the perspective of someone who was there. For example, I wrote from the perspective of a court stenographer in one of the McCarthy trials. This girl decided to write about the first Olympic Games, but seemed to have a basic lack of understanding of history. Her story, which, again, was about the first Olympic Games, from the perspective of an athlete, involved texting, cars, and was absolutely laden with pop culture references. In addition to this, every I was lowercase, and the whole essay was center justified, because of course it was. I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly, but I swear it was in Comic Con or something like that. I didn't want to tell her that her entire story was terrible, because I'm weak, so I just told her to check her capitals and punctuation, and things like that. God, peer reviewing someone's awful work is the worst. I don't know if it's necessary, but I always feel the need to tiptoe on the direct issues like, oh, I don't think they actually had all that stuff back in 1896. I just want to tell them I'm not trying to make any enemies, but your paper makes me want to commit Sudoku. Not a professor, but I had to peer review a bit for my scientific writing course in my first year of college. It was a level 200 class, so there were a few sophomores and juniors. The way how it worked was that at the beginning of the semester our professor had assigned us to groups of 6. During the peer review session she would staple the papers together according to group number and give it to different groups so we wouldn't grade our own group's papers. Around midterms we had to write a mock proposal for a scientific field of our choice. Had to be at least 6 pages long with headings, abstracts, materials, hypothesis, etc. The one who wrote the best proposal got a Dunkin' Donuts gift card. I found one of the juniors' proposals and oh my god, she only wrote 2 pages, had no discernible format, used a typewriter font, had no headings, and it was just her blabbering on about how herbal medicine helped her mental illness. There wasn't any real conclusion because from what I could tell she didn't even have a hypothesis. There was so much wrong with the paper that I just moved on without writing anything. The real kicker is that she always promoted her self-published book on our class discussion board. P.S. I won the gift card. Methinks there's a reason it was self-published. Obligatory, not a teacher but for a lesson one time we were supposed to grade some AP tests to get an idea of what the test would be like. The prompt was like tell about an achievement you made or something. I received a paper that went something like this. Growing up I loved basketball. I would play it all the time. I really enjoyed the game, and I still play it now. I play basketball during the day. Sometimes I play basketball during the night time too. Basketball is fun to play, just on and on and on. About 100 different ways to say they play basketball. Anyways, I gave it a 2, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest, only due to the fact that it had no grammatical errors. Turns out that person received a frickin' 4. Ah frick me, I wrote a stunning essay on the advantages of multilingualism and only received a 4. I for real wish I could have saved that paper because I was so dang proud of it. My time has come. I teach 10th grade English. One girl wrote the world's worst paper. It was incoherent, 5 pages long, had no claim, and was mostly plot summary. It was unreadable. I hated every second of it. I didn't know how to grade it, so I handed it to my co-teacher and was like, you deal with this mess. He gave her a 55, which was generous. So this is a failing paper, right? We handed it back. I thought it was over. A different student turned in a paper, like a week late. I started grading the paper. I reached the second page, and I had this horrible epiphany. It was the same horrible paper. I couldn't compare the 2 papers, because I didn't have the original, but it was the same unreadable garbage. I stopped reading, gave the second version a 45, and moved on. Then an entirely different student, who is not friends with either of the original students, turned in a paper. It was like 2 weeks late, but I agreed to grade it. I got like halfway through the first sentence before I realized it was the same goddamn horrible paper. I almost died. These were all handwritten, so each student rewrote by hand all 5 pages of garbage. I know they were all copied, because they had the same weird spelling errors. I have no idea why any of them thought distributing and copying a paper that had already failed. So I had to read the same piece of garbage paper 3 times and it was so unpleasant. They were supposed to write an argumentative essay based off of an article they were assigned to read, and they were supposed to be 3-4 pages. One of my students turned in a paper very loosely based off of a completely different article, and were therefore making a completely unrelated argument to the prompt I gave them. It was maybe half a page, single spaced, center aligned, and legit written like a really bad advertisement, complete with text speech. So imagine her in a spa ! 1. Taught at a community college. Last paper for Engel 102 was an argument paper. I stated on the directions no stupid arguments like the Holocaust or Sandy Hook didn't happen. Student turns in a Sandy Hook denial paper. Gave her a 55%, which was an F, which put her final grade at an F because of a whole bunch of other crap the nut didn't do in class. One of the sentences was something along the lines of who can blame the crisis actors for doing what they did? Every person just tries to help themselves. We had this one engineering ethics course at my uni that's essentially e-learning, but we had to write an essay at the end. Someone from a year below me put a recipe for pancakes somewhere in the middle and the professor replied to him that he'd have got a passing grade if the recipe'd been any good. I taught 6th grade and asked my students to write 1 paragraph about the novel they are reading. I had a student turn in cat. It is about cats, near pond. No name I think, and then a drawing of Sonic the Hedgehog. God bless that child. probably the one that talked about how the most important result of Columbus discovering America was coffee being introduced to the old world because I just can't live without Starbucks. Okay, so this wasn't a bad paper except for one little thing. I teach high school and one of my students wrote a paper on economics. As I'm reading through the paper, in the middle of the sentence, she wrote Mr. Funky Monkey 233 as a P and then kept on going with the sentence. I was obviously a bit confused, so I circled it, drew a frowny face, and wrote "See me" on the top. I gave it back to her. She reads it and is dead silent. All the other students leave the classroom and she just starts bawling. She's sobbing that her cousin proofread her paper cause he's in college studying economics and she asked him for help. He must have put it in without her noticing. Her cousin emails me owning up to it because he thought she was gonna get heck for it. Peer review and people who don't read the book and then write 3-4 pages. It is obvious they didn't read it. You can also tell who just used SparkNotes. Plus, at teachers who make tests intentionally obscure to screw kids who only used SparkNotes. Frick off. I actually read the book and the questions reference a single sentence in a 200-page book expecting kids who read the book to remember, but kids who used SparkNotes to not remember. If you are going to make questions that obscure, don't write a test. Instead have them pull quotes from the book in a paper. I missed a question and the teacher said, and that's what you get for using SparkNotes, when I legit read the book and never remembered reading that one sentence. Honestly, I read the book and then hit up SparkNotes to see what I forgot because I have terrible comprehension. I'm good with reading and writing about the book. I just can't remember certain details well. My son's English teacher phoned me to discuss one of my son's exam papers. He'd answered one question, written underneath it "This is the only good question in the paper," and spent the rest of the time annotating the exam paper to illustrate why he thought all the other questions were flawed and why sitting the exam was a waste of his time. It was quite creative, in its way, and somewhat postmodernist and structuralist, but at secondary school they're not really looking for that. My sympathies, Mrs. Riley. Not a paper, but an exam. Quite a large chunk of the grade. The student never paid attention, or didn't care. It was EFL classes, and he was forced to go by his parents. His answers for questions on the exam were other answers copied in from the exam. Even his essay question was simply him writing every question. As a high school French teacher, I have students do short essays on historic French topics. They need to present them in class, using as much French as can be expected. Not much for first year, much more for fourth year. I never know what the papers are about until the presentations. One year I got 3 essays on Napoleon, one on Michel de Montaigne, the father of the essay, and one on dolphins. Freaking dolphins. Apparently the last kid had Google translated the French word dolphin, saw that it could mean dolphin, and went with that. The word is historically used in French to describe the heir apparent to the throne, because the flag used by the next person in line for the throne had a big ugly fish on it. But this kid just wrote about dolphin habitats and food preferences. The worst paper I ever personally wrote was for a college French elective course about pop culture. It wasn't too serious a class, and the professor wanted us to have fun. I wrote about the connection between the trash American faux rock documentary film Eddie and the Cruisers and the French poet Arthur Rimbaud. Since Rimbaud is referenced in the film, it wasn't too much of a stretch. I talked about both the poet and the protagonist going into exile, real and perceived homosexuality, and how both men were spurned by lovers before penning masterpieces called Season in Heck. But, yeah, it was so crappy. I wish I still had a copy. Essay on the themes in Anne Frank. Referred to Anne as both Anna and Annie. Said the British bombed her home and that is why she was found. No one knows where she died and she might still be alive. This was an essay on the themes of the diary, not a drunken autobiography. I wanted the student to discuss the themes of survival or growing up or fricking something that wasn't an insane ramble that confused the story of Anne Frank with the story of Princess Anastasia. Good ol' Anastasia Frank. The best paper I ever received was simply this. I'm sorry, mister. I tried. I have failed you. He didn't finish his paper 100%. One of my favorite kids of all time though. Wasn't my class. but a senior last year showed off the 94% he got on a paper arguing that Beowulf was reincarnated as the protagonist from The Road. He also had another paper that he got a 91% on comparing Hamlet to communism. The senior English teacher on our staff is a moron. I wrote a story about how there is no whale in Moby Dong and in fact it's just a gay party on a boat. Got a 90. Bad formatting -10. It's not all about the prompt. Sometimes the prompt is there just to get you started. Not a teacher but one of my teammates got 14 on one of his uni assignments. All you have to do is hit the word count, vaguely talk about the subject and reference moderately well to get a 40, which is considered a pass over here. Needless to say, this is the second time he is resisting second year. I'm entirely not surprised that I'm one of the first English professors to reply. I have so many terrible essay stories that they all kind of blend together. Everything that every other post has described is my normal day to day, so after a while, the remarkably terrible become the norm. I worked for a history professor in college and helped grade some simple assignments. One such assignment was to watch videos in the library. There were a bunch of tapes to choose from, and answer some questions about the video, along with a 1-paragraph summary for each video. Easy, except one student turned in an assignment that was so poorly written, it literally made me ill to try to read it. Punctuation that didn't make sense, crazy spelling errors, random capitalization, absolutely no sentence structure to speak of. It was awful. I gave it back to the prof and told him I couldn't even read it. He told me I was overreacting but that he'd have his wife grade it instead. The next day he told me she couldn't read it because it made her ill to try. SMH. I think he just failed the assignment altogether. I'm not an English teacher, but for a while in college I was a biology TA. To be honest, none of the papers were anything to brag about, and you only had to do it to get full credit. But there was one paper that made me cringe throughout the entire reading of it. It was so painful, I wanted to fail it even though it was just a completion-based assignment. The prompt was evolution, and this kid, for one thing, the paper was turned in handwritten, in his own handwriting, which was absolutely awful, on notebook paper. This is a college course, at a good school, after 2010. There is no excuse for that. And second, the entire paper was on how he didn't believe in evolution because he was a good person who believes in the Bible and no good person who believes in the Bible would believe in evolution. This was a religious school. I'm not convinced you can't believe that God didn't just guide evolution and create man that way, but I am convinced you're an idiot who hasn't listened to very good evidence if you don't believe in evolution. Also, sorry for formatting. I'm on my phone. It was a religious school after all. He should have the highest grade. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.